Drive, welcoming visitors to Red Wing on the Mississippi River. Johnson Filtration Systems, helping produce, treat, and protect the world's water supply. And by Dakota Barge Service, responsibly operating towboats and barges in the St. Paul area.
I think the Mississippi is so much a part of this America. I think that as people start reclaiming what is this America and make it what is about all of us, that I think that the Mississippi is really a part of that.
And I think when people now are trying to find a sense of identity and a sense of place in this modern world where we can be access to everything all over the globe, being on the Mississippi puts you somewhere, and it puts you in a very powerful place that's known all the way around the world.
I think it's very important for people who intend to live here and make this community prosper and flourish. They understand the relationship to the river. And while I don't believe in local nature gods kind of thing, I think there's a spirit of the river. And if we pollute the river or ignore the river, we lose track of who we are.
On an average day in the Twin Cities, more than 250,000 cars will cross over the Mississippi River. For most of us, crossing the river is part of our daily routine. If we're traveling I-94 at rush hour, there's almost always a bottleneck here, so it's a place to be avoided. We may catch a glimpse of the Mississippi from the freeway overpass, but beyond that, the river barely enters our consciousness. The mighty Mississippi is no match for the man-made mega river of malls, subdivisions, and freeways that just keeps rolling along. Once the great highway of commerce and the center of community life, the modern Mississippi has been reduced to little more than a line on a map, a boundary between neighborhoods, something crossed over on the way to somewhere else. Along the way, we've lost something of ourselves, too. The river, the source of our mythology, has been diminished in our collective imagination. This is due in part to the way we've grown our cities. St. Paul, a city born of the river, now turns its back to the water. And Minneapolis seems to have forgotten that before it was the city of lakes, it was the city of the falls. While collectively, at the level of city and state, we still largely ignore the Mississippi. On a personal level, many of us feel a need to reconnect with the spirit of the river. This program is about that sense of rediscovery. It features profiles of Minnesotans who work or live on the river and have a personal stake in its future. Each speaks to a different aspect of river life, either its history, ecology, economy, or culture. Though from widely different backgrounds and lifestyles, they all share a deep and abiding affection for the river. Welcome, then, to a place called Mississippi, Minnesota.
In order to understand the Twin Cities, in order to understand why you and I are here, we have to understand the Mississippi River.
David Lanegren is a St. Paul native and a professor of urban geography at Macalester College. In his view, the Mississippi River is the key to understanding our history and our sense of place.
I think it's important for us to remember the power the Mississippi had on people's minds in the 19th century. It is, and it was then, a fabulous piece of nature. And tourists came from Germany and from Northern Europe to see the bluffs, and they made much of the similarity, imagined or real, between it and the Rhine. And the river ports in the mid to late 19th century were just centers of excitement, of human story. People were making money hand over fist and then losing it almost as fast. The people who were influential in the 19th century urban development had come up the river, so they had this connection of in their minds of their place and the rest of the world linked by the Mississippi. So it's really no accident that James J. Hill would build his house on the bluffs overlooking the river, or Bishop Ireland would build his cathedral on the bluff overlooking the town and the river, or that the state legislature would hire Cass Gilbert to build the state capitol. And if you go around the ring a little bit to Mounds Park, the Aborigines, the Native Americans, built their burial mounds on the bluff overlooking the river. The Twin Cities make absolutely no sense unless you understand their relationship with the river. The fact that there is a downtown in Minneapolis and a downtown in St. Paul is a factor of the river.
The reason there are Twin Cities is because of the river. The falls at St. Anthony, Minneapolis provided the power for sawmills and later flour mills, making Minneapolis a center of industry. But the shallow river and deep gorge near the falls made commercial river transportation difficult. Where the river deepened and water transportation became viable was at St. Paul. It became the river port and later the railroad center and capital city.
So, to the geographer, there's no mystery why there are two downtowns and why there were twin cities, and why we live in this bipolar metropolitan area now. But I can't explain that to anybody without talking about the river. You can't understand this city. You can't understand why in St. Paul the street systems don't make any sense. They're lined up to the curve of the river. You can't understand why we refer to the area south of downtown as the West Side, unless you understand that rivers only have two sides, an east side and a west side.
As Lanegren explains, St. Paul's West Side confuses visitors because it is actually south of downtown. The name is a holdover from the era of steamboat transportation. The West Side refers not to its orientation to the city, but to the river. Since the Mississippi is considered a north-south river, it can have only an east and west side. To a steamboat captain who would approach the city from the south, anything to the left was the west side.
The river and the town in that mid-19th century period were synonymous. You couldn't have St. Paul without the Mississippi River. I mean, it's really a child of the river. Then that child, in turn, remade the river to its satisfaction.
Thing's heavier than I remembered.
It's quite heavy, like 80 pounds.
What is it?
80.
All right.
Nice. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Okay, you want to get in?
All right, hold me steady there.
Okay, gotcha.
Amy Middleton is a Twin Cities-based environmental activist. For the last 5 years, she's been working on cleaning up the Mississippi River.
You ready?
Yep.
Here we go.
The tools of Amy's trade are a canoe, her eyes, and a basic understanding of environmental law.
Every citizen in the state or in the country has access to information about what that pipe that's going into their river in their backyard contains. And that's all available at the state through this Pollution Control Agency. And not a lot of people know that, but it's very empowering information to have.
This looks like a street runoff, storm runoff.
Yeah, let's check this out. Looks pretty gross, though. Oops. Yeah, can you just hold the canoe? I'm going to write down where we're at here.
Okay. Not running very hard right now.
No, it hasn't rained in a while.
Under the Clean Water Act of 1972, citizens like Amy are allowed to sue polluters. Working with grassroots environmental groups like Citizens for a Better Environment, Amy has been particularly effective in using this legal strategy to enforce pollution laws. Amy's colleague, Lisa Dorr, statewide director of CBE, explains how citizen litigation works.
Under the Clean Water Act, companies are given a permit to pollute and required in that permit to report how much pollution they dump into a body of water on a daily or quarterly basis. Those reports are actually written down on pieces of paper, discharge monitoring reports, and sent to the regulatory agency. And it's up to the agency to look at those reports, and if there's violations, to take some kind of enforcement action.
Hi, I called a little while ago, and I'm Amy Middleton, and I wanted the Coke DMRs.
The monitoring discharge?
What has happened in the 1980s with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is they took very few enforcement actions against reported violations. So under the Clean Water Act, people like Amy Middleton can go down, take a look at the reports that polluters file on their permits and see if they're violating their permit. And if they find that there's violations, they can go ahead and file suit against them. For example, in 1989, we settled a suit with the Coke Oil Refinery for over 300 violations of the Clean Water Act, where they were polluting the Mississippi River and reporting that pollution to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. However, the Pollution Control Agency wasn't taking any kind of enforcement action.
And we used the Pollution Control Agency files to do a citizen litigation, and it was the first and largest in the state of Minnesota under the Clean Water Act. And we won. We got a $2.2 million settlement, and the plant then also had to spend another $11 million upgrading their plant so they didn't have these discharges. So that was sort of one of the beginning cases of that I was involved in sort of working through the litigation system.
The money awarded CBE from the Coke refinery suit went to fund more research on polluters. With more money to spend, Middleton began to look for other ways to uncover illegal pollution.
One of the things that I like about Amy is a certain creativity in approaching problems, and the idea of hiring someone to take you out in an airplane and do infrared aerial photos of pollution along the Mississippi River is a really creative way to approach enforcing pollution laws.
The infrared aerial photography combined with surveys by canoe, a technique called ground truthing, resulted in another big case for Middleton and CBE.
An environmental group is accusing the city of Minneapolis of polluting the river it's supposed to be purifying. Environmentalists say the Minneapolis Water Works is pumping sludge into the Mississippi just beyond the city limits.
Last fall, classic canoeing down the river, sort of minding my own business in the middle of an afternoon in North St. Paul, or North Minneapolis, and the river changed colors. I mean, literally, there was a line of pollution of some sort.
The researcher said she followed the plume of material all the way down here to Boom Island. She wondered why the water abruptly changed color, and she suspected some of the factories nearby.
I suspected some bigger fish, and little did I know that it was going to be the city of Minneapolis, so it was quite a surprise. I followed it back upstream with who I was with, and we sort of laid in the bushes and kind of got a read on where it was on River Road. It had these funny big ponds, and it turned out to be the city of Minneapolis's drinking water plant. We were shocked when we found it.
Citizens for a Better Environment charges the water plant is releasing far too many solids. Its permit allows 30 milligrams per liter. Readings say the actual discharges have gone as high as 25,000 milligrams.
We filed that intent to sue on March 25th, 1991. On May 3rd, they quit polluting the Mississippi River. So the Minneapolis Water Works had been polluting the river blatantly for over 10 years. 5 weeks after we filed an intent to sue, they stopped, and they haven't polluted the river for over 6 months. So the direct result, stopping millions of pounds of pollution going into the Mississippi River that Amy's activities have had. People like Amy Middleton are a real key part of making sure that pollution laws are enforced. Amy's been trained in water resources, and she's got that overall understanding of how the environment is interrelated. At the same time, she has an understanding of what the legal system is and how it works. Finally, and this is what I think is unique, is that she really considers that the river is a sacred body of water. There's a lot of people who love the Mississippi River, but not all of them have a chance to really take action on it.
I'm definitely a watchdog. I definitely can't go down the Mississippi River or any body of water without sort of keeping an eye out for what's going on. And it's good because I share that information with a lot of people, and there's a lot of citizens up and down the river that now have access to that information because of the fact sheets that I've given them or workshops that I've trained them in. So that feels great. My work is for the Mississippi River. I don't get paid to do this or anything like that, and the river's my boss in doing cases like this. I mean, it's great. The river in that little section is better off now that we've been involved.
In other words, the greatest change in elevation of all 29 Gulf rivers.
The Mississippi River, as we know it today, channeled by concrete and controlled by locks and dams, is as much a man-made object as a force of nature. It's easy to take these feats of engineering for granted and to forget the role that human hands have had in shaping the river environment. Our first attempts to control the flow of nature started around the turn of the century. A collection of historic photographs that sheds new light on this period has recently resurfaced.
Thanks, Carl.
John Atkinson is the historian for the St. Paul district of the Army Corps of Engineers. Thanks to his alert detective work, the Army Corps was able to rediscover this valuable album of photographs. It has been in Corps possession for nearly 100 years, but had fallen into obscurity in recent times. Atkinson did some digging and found the historic photos in a desk drawer aboard an Army Corps dredge boat where they had been collecting dust for over 50 years.
Indeed, when we did check, we found out that they were blue cyanotype photographs, and the set nearly identical to the one in Washington, which the owner in Washington had brought to Sotheby's auction house in New York, and the head of photography there said that these photographs were some of the best of the 19th century that she had ever seen in her work at Sotheby's.
The photos, called cyanotypes for their distinctive blue and white color, are views of the upper Mississippi River taken around the turn of the century by an Army Corps engineer named Henry Bosse.
Henry Bosse was a German immigrant, came from Germany in the 1870s possibly. He was a draftsman, and a cartographer, and a photographer, and an artist. He had a lot of skills. The primary skill was being a draftsman and a cartographer, and that is the capacity in which he worked for approximately 25 years.
Not much is known about Henry Bosse's life. The master photographer left but one likeness of himself, and no diaries or letters that might flesh out his sketchy biography. But through his work, the portrait of a complex man emerges, one whose vision embraces both the precision of science and the inspiration of art.
He was a map maker, a cartographer, and that was his principal profession. So he had worked on several surveys of the Mississippi River prior to taking these photographs. So he knew the Mississippi River intimately above St. Louis. By knowing the river intimately, he knew how to photograph it as well. He was also an engineer, so his ability to look at complex subjects like bridges, all the steel work in the bridges, and he could photograph a bridge very well, better than an artist who may focus on landscapes. Yet Henry Bosse was also an artist and focused on landscapes, as some of the photographs show. So he combined engineering skills, drafting skills, cartography skills, artistic skills into a single concept that allowed him to photograph the river in a unique way.
The value of the Bossi photos on the art market continues to climb. Some experts now place their worth at close to $1 million, but it's their value as historical documents that makes them truly priceless. They tell the story of a river and a society in transition.
I don't know how he determined what he would take pictures of. I've never seen any diary or anything that he wrote that would tell me this, but for some reason, in the ones that you've shown me, he's got a very nice sample of the old river and the potential urban industrial river that we know today. He's got a wonderful shot of Nininger, for example, the great ghost town or boom town of Ignatius Donnelly, and it had already busted. He's got this wonderful shot of the river, the sweep of the river, and some person seated on the bank, and you can let your imagination run and think it's Donnelly's ghost. But you can see the attraction of the river there, no heavy railroad signs, no steamboats on it, just this wonderful pastoral river. Then on the other hand, he has a wonderful shot of St. Paul from 1885, and you can see the original bridge across the Mississippi. You can see the 1885 Flats community. You can see the quarry on the river bluffs, and you get a sense of St. Paul remaking the riverfront, not as a steamboat port, but as an industrial port, as a low-income neighborhood, and all the things that we think of the river as being today.
I've been swimming kind of strange strokes for me because everything gets tired, so I try and make up new things to get through it. It's still a leisurely swim, but some leisurely swims are longer than others, I guess.
Billy Camano's leisurely swim is an attempt to swim the entire length of the Mississippi River, some 2,500 miles. Camano is a performance artist and musician from Rushford, Minnesota, and has been performing this work called Swimmin' the River on and off since 1987.
I'm not in any hurry, and I see the piece as a performance, and I see my audience as anyone who happens to be on either bank or following along.
I says, up that lazy river. Oh, how happy I will be. I says, up the lazy river with me.
Whether clowning for his support crew or reciting one of his river raps at a river landing, Camano can usually be seen performing in and out of the water. He's an irrepressible entertainer who seems energized by the limelight. He's also an impassioned environmentalist, and he sees his Swimmin' the River project as his way of raising awareness about the issues of water quality.
I was seeing the river as a metaphor for water, and water being a source of life. I felt it was representing all the water everywhere, and I thought if I could make a statement about it and use my body to make the statement, then maybe people would think.
I've been swimming the river, and I've got to say that water is rising, and it's coming our way. You be diking and damming and holding it back, but the river keeps right on taking out the slack. People building towns all up and down that river route. You got your water inlets upstream and your sewage coming out. You may think it's clean upstream, but it's probably not. It's like drinking and pissing in the same pot. And there's sewage and poison and toxic waste from spraying and dumping all over the place. From farm, factory, front lawn, garden, and golf course, we've got to face facts. We are the source.
Camano's base of operations is this farmhouse outside of Rushford, otherwise known as the Experimental Art Research Terminal of Artworks USA. As part of his performance concept, he's developing technology to protect himself from the dangers of swimming in a river polluted with toxic chemicals. While some of these experiments are more whimsical than practical, they make a serious statement about a very real problem.
I've been working on this for quite a while. That's why it's the X2C. It's going to have Lexan over the faceplate so I'll be able to see, and then it has rubber arms and hands, and there will be some legs that are totally waterproof added to it as well. Yeah, I think everyone will be wearing these in the future, unless we can do something about our serious problems with our water. People have a tendency to either make swimming pools and put chlorine in it and decide that's a natural way to swim, or else they'll probably be wearing these babies. And I'm going to have the corner on the market, you know.
Until he perfects the X2C, Kamano will continue to take his chances in the water. So far, his only skin protection has been a coating of Vaseline for his body and a liberal application of sunblock for his face.
So it looks like I'll be getting wet in a few minutes.
11:31.
Swimming during the summer and then only when his schedule and limited resources allow, Kamano has already completed 880 miles of the river, or about 1/3 of its total length. It's been a struggle both physically and financially. So far, the project has existed without any grant support.
Right now, we're about 43 miles from the Missouri border, so it would be
To stay afloat financially, Kamano and his partner Denise Gibson have had to build a grassroots network of supporters.
When Billy first came up with the idea of this particular performance, he kind of, bounced it off me, and I was like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. Swim 2,552 miles? Yeah, no problem. And then he actually decided he was going to do it. And so we started, looking at the logistics of it. And it involves a lot. We have to get our crews together. The crews have all been volunteers. They take a week's worth of, their vacation time and come with us. The crew has been following Billy in the water in canoes so that should he get into a distressful situation where he might need assistance, there's somebody there to actually help him.
The crew that comes along with me, the project couldn't be realized without them. They usually have some sort of love or connection with the river, but we've had people out that have never been on the Mississippi before, and I think that's very exciting. And I think that's an important part of the project, that we can get people to know a little bit more about the river by just spending some time with us out there.
The momentum of interest and participation as we come downriver is getting larger. It's the type of a thing that captures the imagination. It makes people very environmentally aware. They say, well, I'm one person, nothing I can do is going to make a difference. And you have to remind them that as an individual, perhaps your individual action is not going to make the difference. But it's all those individual actions compounded that do make a difference.
We made it!
By the time Billy gets to the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to be one big blowout party to celebrate it. And there are going to be people from all reaches of the Mississippi there to be a part of it, because people from all along the Mississippi have participated. And a lot of them I know want to be there at the end to be able to say, I helped make this happen.
In its natural state, the Mississippi River had numerous back channels or side channels. It had large wetland areas. It was full of sandbars. It was a very shallow river, and one that went up and down, a lot of fluctuation in it. The river at this time did not have one single channel down which a steamboat could go. There might be a channel that ran along one side of the river for a while, and then it would stop. And you'd have to cross a sandbar and find where the channel started again and pick it up for a little while.
The Army Corps, with congressional approval, embarked on an ambitious plan to improve the river for steamboat traffic.
In the 4.5-foot channel, the project under which the project which these photographs document is that first effort to systematically improve the Mississippi to make it a real navigation route, a viable navigation route, and a route that can be competitive with railroads.
To focus the river for steamboat traffic, the Corps began construction on a series of wing dams.
Dams that would help project into the river and narrow it like a garden hose being turned down so that the faster it goes, the more sediment it can carry, and it can scour itself and scour away sandbars.
He's got it composed so you can see exactly the process. The laying down of the brush, the crew that's working, putting down the brush, and the rock going down on the wing dam. So it only takes you about 35 seconds to figure out how these wing dams were built. And the interesting thing is that the wing dams were built with local products. They're sort of vernacular architecture of a very interesting sort. Willows cut along the river and stone out of the bluffs along the river. So using the river to redefine itself, and then of course make the channel more stable.
The 4.5-foot channel project and the later 6-foot channel project made river navigation easier. The treacherous and ever-shifting river that young Samuel Clemens had plied as a steamboat pilot in the 1860s had been changed forever. The Corps hoped a continuous channel would revive a declining steamboat industry, but it was not to be. By the late 1880s, another form of steam transportation had come into its own.
With the Civil War and after the Civil War, steamboat traffic begins to decline because about 8 railroads had reached the Mississippi River before the Civil War. 1 had crossed it. Within 3 years at the end of the war, 3 railroad bridges crossed the river in Iowa alone. When the railroads reach the Mississippi, they simply interrupt through commerce between St. Paul and St. Louis. Steamboats simply go to La Crosse or to some other town and drop off their goods. So you see short hauls versus the long haul.
As the railroads began crossing the river and then paralleling it, they took away all traffic from the Mississippi except timber. Later, that too disappeared as the white pine forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota were logged off in the late 1880s.
The sum of these pictures indicates to me that he knew the riverboat era was drawing to an end. Not that there would be an end of riverboats, but the riverboat as a human passenger transport, as a mail carrier, as a packet boat, he knew that was over. There's an absolutely gorgeous shot called the view from the bluffs near Fountain City, looking upstream. Of all these pictures, I think this is the most picturesque because you have the wonderful valley of the river, you see the bluffs, and then you see this lonesome steamboat pushing a big raft of logs. But you get a sense of this guy understanding that the valley was being logged off. The boats that had brought people to the valley were also going to change the nature of the valley. So he picked up some wonderful shots of the change in the economy of the valley, and also I think had a sense of the beauty of these small towns. There's one photograph of Genoa, which is really quite a nice setting, but in this shot you'd think, golly, that's a town I have to go live in. Again, we have this man with the white shirt that he has in his photographs. It'd be fun to know who that is.
Well, when I first came down here, this island was pretty much a wilderness island. There was no footbridge to get over here. You had to crawl on a log. Very few people ever visited the island. It was a pretty wilderness area. Over the years, it's kind of evolved into more of a community area.
John Rupke lives here on Lower Latch Island. He's one of about 75 residents who live in this floating Mississippi River community near Winona, Minnesota. The members of this community live year-round in converted boat garages, known locally as boat houses.
They're not really boat houses, although they're called boat houses. They're not really boat garages. They don't move around, so they're not houseboats. They stay in one place. They have no motor on them. So really the best way to describe them is a floating home. Yeah, they had to duck to get under the old train bridge. Remember the old train bridge? Yeah. They had to, when the flood was up real high, they had to duck to get under in their canoe to get under there.
Rupke's the acknowledged elder statesman and unofficial tribal leader of this community. He's achieved this status in part through seniority, having lived here longer than most, but also because of his background. He's a former Christian brother with a PhD in educational psychology. In 1979, after 22 years of teaching, he left the Christian Brothers and moved to the river.
When I was a Christian brother, a lot of the spiritual readings made sense, but I felt like I really wasn't living that life that was being described. The principles all sounded good, but then at the same time, you'd live in a big mansion, you know, with lush furnishings and so on. And I think that when I came down to the river and moved on the river, it's like it enabled me to move my lifestyle in the direction of what in my mind made sense as a good way to live. I think the big satisfaction of living on the water is being in tune with nature. The fact that you're out, you know, away from the city, you can be in tune to the sky and planets and the stars. The metaphor I use a lot is that living here is like taking a journey through the various parts of the planet without ever moving, because in the winter, it's like living up in the Arctic. You can have 20, 30 below zero weather. The river's frozen. You're driving out to the boathouse in your car. And 6 months later, in midsummer, it's like the South Sea Islands. I like the fact that this is a very benign way to affect the environment. You're floating, so you can only hold so much weight. The weight of your possessions has to stay constant. Because your possessions are fixed in terms of volume, it helps you to live a life of simplicity. So to me, it's very much connected with what's a good way to live, what's a good way to go through life, what's a good thing to strive for. To me, simplicity is a good thing to strive for. I started reading the Hindus when I moved here on the river, and for the Hindus, the river is a holy river, the holy river, Ganges, Mother Ganga. And some people say, oh, well, if you want to go to the Holy River, you got to go to India, to the Ganges. But they call that the Holy River just because that was the river that was near them. You know, this is the river that was near us. If the Hindus were living here, this would be the Holy River.
Sheets, and I'll begin to mark them up, and then I'll come back over and make the final sketch later.
William Moorish is the director of the Design Center for the American Urban Landscape, an urban design think tank at the University of Minnesota. In the summer of 1990, he led a group of 40 students and scholars on the trip of a lifetime.
The trip we took last summer, the expedition of the Fourth Coast, Mississippi River trip, was an attempt to get in contact with what is American about American cities by taking that classic trip Mark Twain writes about in Life on the Mississippi, and others who have written about in many, many journals.
The students and scholars spent 8 weeks studying the river, including 4 weeks on the river, traveling by boat from St. Louis to Minneapolis. The trip was a classic Mississippi journey in all respects except one. They started at the bottom.
The reason we came upriver rather than go downriver was not only to have the classic journey of a European explorer, an external explorer coming up into the land, but also to see the land rise up and to come up into the land and return home. So we could show low lighting there and then show on this side high lighting. Yeah, great. That was good. Let's build something.
Taking the classic Mississippi River journey and turning it on its head is typical of Morsh's overall approach to design. One of the think tank's goals is to expand the definition of urban design beyond a traditional preoccupation with buildings and downtown cores. In rethinking the role of urban designer, Morsh has evolved his own highly idiosyncratic form of visual language.
What I like to do is stuck somewhere between drawing and diagramming, and many of these drawings are thoughts in process. This one we drew very early after coming here from Southern California to the north. I drew this view looking the other way, rather than always seems we show Minnesota as part of the Great North. I decided to show Minnesota as being in front of the Great South. And in drawing it, I discovered a whole different perspective of the relationship between where we are and our sister and brother cities of the Mississippi River, and that we're between, in this giant broad valley from the Rockies to the Appalachians. This giant plain is not only the Midwest, but a giant big valley, as we call it. And in that reorientation, we discovered some of the early ideas for our river trip, and we began to understand we had to take this trip right here in the midst of this great urban plain. What I was surprised by or struck by was the amount of human settlement and building and making of not only settlements along the river, but the actually making of the river into a proper piece for civilization. Predating colonial arrival, people have been involved in either worshiping, trading, building forms influenced by what the river made.
One of the high points of the journey was a visit to Cahokia, Illinois, the site of an ancient Native American settlement located about 12 miles east of modern St. Louis. Nature has since shifted the course of the river, but in ancient times, Cahokia overlooked a bend in the Mississippi.
It's the largest earthen mound in North America, 100 feet high, called Monk's Mound. And it was a great settlement of a city of 20 to 30,000 inhabitants, the largest city in North America from 700 to 1300 AD, and was not surpassed in population until Philadelphia reached it in about 1805.
As Morsh explains, the history of Cahokia challenges many of our traditionally held assumptions about the settling of America.
You look out across the mound and see the St. Louis Arch 12 miles away, and you begin to see that you're not just at the edge of the West, which is what the big sort of gateway is about, the gateway to the West and Jefferson's Manifest Destiny. But you see it from a different perspective. You begin to ask the question, why are people settling here since the Indians weren't in a great migration to the West? Standing on Monk's Mound, you begin to understand and see that it's part of a great circle of gathering between the four rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, and the Illinois.
Cahokia illustrates an idea that's central to Morse's view of the river, an idea that's as true today as it was 3,000 years ago. He sees the Mississippi less as a passageway or a way to get from A to B, and more as a gathering place, a unifying force at the center of our lives.
You begin to see that the Mississippi is made up of, one could say, great circles of gathering, and it's one sort of gathering area to the next. The Mississippi Delta is almost a world unto itself between Memphis and Vicksburg. And then you move northward, and one could almost see Minneapolis and Itasca in a great big circle as the river winds its way up in what they call the hook through Bemidji, and you almost make this great circle of source waters and coming down. So we began to start drawing circles instead of lines.
What are you doing here so slow?
Hey, I'm going off early.
Wow, really early. Must be pretty slow.
It is. It's very slow.
For Håkan and Penny Miller, the Mississippi River is a world apart from the river most of us know. Their river is the working river of the urban Twin Cities. They both work in river-related jobs. Håkan works for a local barge company, and Penny runs the No Wake Cafe, a floating restaurant in St. Paul. But the river is not something they leave behind when they come home from work. They also live on the water in a houseboat anchored in downtown St. Paul. As Håkan explains, they both have been drawn to the water from an early age.
We both spent a lot of time on water as small children and whilst we were growing up. And we're drawn to the river. And if we had different ways of making a living, we'd still try and have it be connected to the water.
Håkan was the first to be lured by the river. He's been working on the Mississippi for most of his adult life. He's worked as a deckhand, a towboat pilot, and as a tour boat operator. He currently works as a boat dispatcher for Upper River Services, one of two remaining local barge companies. Upper River Services is a barge fleeting, cleaning, and repair service located in St. Paul. They provide local support to the long-haul boats that operate between St. Louis and St. Paul.
So what are we talking tomorrow night? We're talking another 4-boat night?
What do you think? Is there any difference between Becky and Kimball tonight and when?
It's a short tow. They'll be fine.
Like other industries, the barge business has had to adapt to changes in the economy. In an increasingly global economy, the Mississippi is seen as just one part of a larger transportation system.
We view the Upper Mississippi River as a vital transportation link between the Upper Midwest agricultural production areas and the rest of the world. We depend on corn and soybeans out and fertilizer in. The basic reason for our being is to service Midwestern farmers. If they did not produce a surplus that they exported overseas, we wouldn't need this system.
While the barges and towboats of St. Paul are a familiar sight and a welcome bit of local color, Miller says few Minnesotans understand exactly what they do or what they mean to the local economy.
I think people are aware of our transportation industry, but I think they're unaware of the volume. The percentage of North American agricultural export that goes just through St. Paul alone is 6 or 7% annually. You combine that with the rest of the river system, you get an awful lot of agricultural produce going on down the river.
A half-mile upriver from where Håkan works, and just a few hundred yards past the Miller's houseboat, lies the No Wake Cafe.
This is a no-wake zone, which is an area of the river that's designated because there is sensitive shoreline. Anything that could be damaged by a boat throwing a wave or a wake. So this is a no-wake zone, and that's why we're the No Wake Cafe.
Something to drink to start off with today? Coffee? Coffee? Hot tea?
When I first came here, I would always be surprised when I talked to people about the river and what went on here, and most of them were hardly aware that there was anything that was going on here. I mean, they knew the Mississippi River was here, but they had very little idea about commercial traffic and boat traffic, and I mean, even which way the river flows, which is kind of an old joke that we have around here. So part of what we try to do here is get people to have that little bit of exposure to it and develop a little bit of curiosity about what goes on here. I think that's part of the reason that people are so unaware of this stuff, is they don't actually see very much of it. And when suddenly there's a towboat 10 feet away from you, and they're pretty good size, it's a lot to look at. It fills up these windows. I've always been kind of turned on by the idea of getting people to try and see some of that, even if it's only as someone eating lunch on a floating cafe.
A lot of people have asked us, you've taken this long journey, what can we do with this information besides learning to appreciate this place? How we might use it here in the Twin Cities. And I think one of the first things to think about is the fact that if one looks at a giant map of the area, the river really is our centerpiece. This is the boundary of the metropolitan area of St. Paul and Minneapolis. So to get the people to understand how powerful the Minnesota and the Mississippi River are to the spatial structure of the area, we exaggerated the topography of the two rivers, and you begin to say, wow, they make the three major rooms of our city. It is our centering device in many respects. And the question is, so what are we going to do with this center?
One possible answer, Morris says, is to develop urban spaces that reinforce the presence of the river in our daily lives. Spaces like Mounds Park and St. Paul.
I think this area here is a really good example of a wonderful urban space where the Mississippi River is a piece of nature, but in the context of the city. And out here you see the neighborhoods on one side and the bridges, the state capitol, downtown. And what's even interesting way out in the distance is the city of Minneapolis, which marks the falls and the point at which this whole canyon, which extends all the way down to St. Louis, starts. And so what you have here is a great sort of urban, might call it a giant urban piazza, great public room where many things come together. Also, the significance of the site from historical vantage point of the Native American site, mounds that exist here. Anybody can come to this point and see the symbols of many, many cultures and ethnic backgrounds coming together and finding basically the common ground, the common interest of love of the water, love of the Mississippi River. And this is really the line that connects us together.
I think it's important for us to remember the power the Mississippi had on people's minds in the 19th century. It is and it was then.
So he combined engineering skills, drafting skills, cartography skills, artistic.
My work is for the Mississippi River. I don't get paid to do this or anything like that, and the river's my boss.
And I thought if I could make a statement about it and use my body to make the statement, then maybe people would...
The big satisfaction of living on the water is being in tune with nature. The fact that you're out, away from the city.
Well, I guess that's part of what we try to do here is get people to have that little bit of exposure to it and develop a little bit of curiosity.
We begin to see that the Mississippi is made up of, one could say, great circles of gathering, and it's one sort of gathering area to the next. The Mississippi Delta.
Coming up, it's more in the life of that wacky special agent Peter Chapman. The Piglet Files are next. Then tomorrow, Realms of the Russian Bear continues with a journey from the red deserts of Central Asia to the icy peaks of the Celestial Mountains running along the Chinese border. Realms of the Russian Bear, tomorrow night at 7, here on Channel 2. Mississippi, Minnesota is made possible in part by the historic St. James Hotel, since 1875 welcoming visitors to Red Wing on the Mississippi River. Johnson Filtration Systems, helping produce, treat, and protect the world's water supply. And by Dakota Barge Service, responsibly operating towboats and barges in the St. Paul area.
This program was produced by KTCA, a Minnesota original.
Coming up next, the Britcom that's so top secret, we can't even tell you if it's funny or not. The Piglet Files is next.
Next time, Realms of the Russian Bear travels to forbidding desert landscapes, alive with a surprising variety of animals, and the towering icy peaks of some of the world's highest mountains, where legends abound of mysterious unseen creatures. Join us as nature continues our unprecedented exploration of the former Soviet Union, the Red Deserts, and the Celestial Mountains on Realms of the Russian Bear.
Rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals.
The cause of the outbreak is unknown, and there's yet
no evidence of contagion.
It was the greatest challenge they would ever face.
Your friend has pneumonia. He has a high fever.
How high?
105.
I'm still sorry. It's not fair. It's not fair!
A crisis that would tear their lives apart.
David taught me that life is only what you put into it.
But one that would also bring them closer together. Longtime companion.
Saturday night at 8:30.
Monday night's broadcast schedule is brought to you in part by Hirschfield's Decorating Centers, celebrating 98 years of service to the people of Minnesota. Deluxe Corporation, providing check printing and related services to America's financial industry. The Bayport Foundation, supported by Anderson Windows and Patio Doors, and by the members of Channel 2.
Sunday, September 16th, 1492. Today there were some clouds, and it was a great delight to enjoy the morning. Nothing was lacking except to hear nightingales.
Columbus sails again in an extraordinary 3-hour special. Columbus's magnificent voyage.
Sunday night at 7, here on Channel 2.
Next time on Austin City Limits, two of country's hottest new singers, Travis Tritt.
Here's a quarter, call someone you care.
And from San Antonio, Holly Dunn.
Friday night at 10, here on Channel 2. You're watching member-supported Channel 2.
The best of British comedy is brought to you locally by Trichromatic Paints Incorporated, covering the spectrum of industrial finishes. Luthold and Anderson, investment portfolio management, innovative while conservative. The customers of Rameli Printing and Northwestern Print Crafters, commercial printers and typesetters since 1863. Antiques, Minnesota, 200 dealers recycling America's past since 1979. City Pages, the alternative news and arts weekly of the Twin Cities. And by Brits Pub and Eating Establishment, featuring Whitbread Ale and other traditional English products.